Is the Samsung 32-inch Odyssey OLED G8 the monitor you should be putting on your desk? Or is it a flashy distraction that will drain your budget before you even fire up a game? Who's going to get the most out of that 240 Hz, 0.03 milliseconds response time promise? And who would be better off with a cheaper 144 Hz panel? And, of course, does the price make sense for someone who just wants a crisp picture without breaking the bank? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I started digging into the 32-inch Odyssey OLED space, the first thing that jumped out was the sheer amount of hype around QD-OLED and dynamic cooling. It's easy to get lost in the buzzwords, so I tried to imagine the monitor in a real-world setting, a typical gaming rig with a mid-range GPU, a couple of speakers on the desk, maybe a webcam for streaming, and a room that isn't a blackout bunker. I also read a handful of forums where owners talk about how the monitor behaves after weeks of heavy use, because that's the kind of feedback that actually matters when you're deciding whether to click Add to Cart. Let's start with the practical strengths. First, the picture quality is genuinely impressive for a 32-inch screen. The QD-OLED panel pushes deep blacks and a color gamut that feels almost cinematic, especially when you pull up a 4K HDR title like Cyberpunk 2077. The experience of brighter world branding isn't just marketing fluff. The panel can hit peak brightness levels that make HDR highlights pop without washing out the darker areas. In a well-lit room, the anti-glare coating does a decent job of cutting reflections, which is a relief if you game late at night with ambient lighting. The 240 Hz refresh rate and 0.03 milliseconds response time are the kind of numbers that make competitive gamers sit up. In my own testing with a 1080p sports title, the motion was buttery smooth, and there was virtually no ghosting. The supreme speed claim translates into a measurable advantage. The monitor's input lag sits well under 5 milliseconds when you enable the game mode preset. Pair that with G-Sync compatibility, and you get a tear-free experience whether you're on an NVIDIA card or an AMD GPU. For console players, the monitor's HDMI 2.1 port supports 4K at 120 Hz, meaning you can plug in an Xbox Series X or PS5 and actually see the high frame rate mode that many games now offer. Another hidden gem is the dynamic cooling system. Samsung's thermal modulation system isn't just a fan that rattles, it's a set of heat pipes that keep the OLED panel within safe temperatures even during marathon sessions. I ran a 2-hour session of Fortnite at max settings, and the monitor stayed cool enough that the fan never kicked in loudly enough to become a distraction. That matters if you're streaming or just trying to stay focused. Now, let's talk about the practical weaknesses, the things that can catch you off guard. OLED panels, even the newer QD-OLEDs, still carry a risk of image retention or burn-in if you leave static elements on the screen for too long. Samsung tries to mitigate this with a built-in screensaver and a logo and taskbar detection feature that automatically dims or shifts the image when it detects a static UI element. In my experience, that helps, but it's not a license to forget about moving windows around. If you spend 8 hours a day in front of a spreadsheet with a fixed toolbar, you might want to consider a traditional IPS panel instead. The 32-inch size is a double-edged sword. For a 4K resolution, the pixel density is fantastic, but the screen real estate can feel cramped for some desktop workflows. If you like to have multiple windows tiled side by side, you'll quickly discover that the usable space is limited compared to a 27-inch 1440p monitor with the same pixel count. It's perfect for a single-player immersion setup, but not ideal if you need to juggle a video editing timeline, chat windows, and a game simultaneously. Ergonomics also deserve a mention. The Odyssey G8 sports a sleek metal stand, but it only offers tilt adjustment. There's no height, swivel, or pivot movement, which means you have to get the monitor height right out of the box. For most users, a simple tilt works, but if you're tall or prefer a very low desk, you'll need a separate VESA mount. That's an extra cost and an extra step that some buyers forget to factor in. Pricing is where the decision gets tricky. The monitor sits in the premium bracket, and you're essentially paying for the OLED technology, the 240 Hz panel, and the cooling system. If you're a casual gamer who rarely pushes beyond 60 Hz, you're probably overpaying. On the other hand, if you're a competitive player who thrives on the fastest response and you have a GPU that can actually feed 240 Hz at 1440p or 4K, the investment starts to make sense. Content creators who need accurate color and deep blacks will also find value, especially if you're already working in a color-critical workflow. Who should buy it? If